it seems as I've overlooked something. One moment. Oh, that's not it. No, okay. Oh, you're the folks that want to know about delivering electricity. You're not an engineering group, are you? Okay. This note is not real complete, as usual, but it wouldn't have mattered anyway. I would have overlooked it just the same. I am sorry. I must confess to you right from the beginning that I have a significant diminished capacity for coping with the ordinary demands of life. And in simpler terms, I just sometimes struggle with everyday things. And that's because I get onto a project and I get so focused that I forget everything. What day it is, what month it is, and especially what time it is. You know, there's one thing that I have impatience with, and that's the clock. You know, I never had a clock in my workroom. I don't believe in watching the clock. Well, let me take that back. We did have one clock, but we had removed the hands. A couple others we had in there prior to that, we removed the works. Well, I don't know what to tell you. You want to know about electricity and how that came about and what role that I played in this. And so there are several stories that I can tell you, but I want to tell you the setting in which this took place. The setting in which we brought this out. And this, of course, you know I invented. Oh, you're too sharp of a crowd for me to convince you of that, aren't I? You know that Alexander invented the telephone, and it worked, but you'd have never bought it. You couldn't understand. Developed a little piece of tin in there that rattled, and yes, the invention was there, and the patent was correct, but it wasn't commercially acceptable at that time. You know what you have to do as an inventor, you deal with a crazy civilization, and a civilization that resists change. Takes 6 to 7 years to bring something. It's one thing to invent something, it's quite another to bring it out into the market. And you are, by the way, the market. You're the ones that make the final decision. And if it doesn't have utility, in other words, it must work, and you must see value in it. And without utility and value, there's no sale. Does that make sense? That's what I live by anyway. My first invention was an electric vote recorder for the legislature. I took it to Boston and I took it to Washington. I thought it would speed things up. You see, I had been a telegrapher in the Midwest, traveling mostly with the Western Union. I was just a teenager. The Civil War was on. We were referred to as lightning slingers. And you know, the telegraph at that time was the most rapid means of communication. And we teenagers were the ones that took to it. And we knew it better than anyone else because I guess we still had our curiosity and our interest. And so I became one of those. And you don't have time for me to go through how that happened. But 5.5 years in the Midwest, I learned a lot about telegraphy and took a lot of orders from generals and passed them along to other generals during the war. But most of my work was with the AP. And a lot of that, I thought, had taught me a great deal about politics. And I thought if I could come up with a device where they could take those votes quickly electrically, with a little switch, yay or nay, it would speed things up, and that would be a great invention. So after the Boston legislature seemed to have no interest, I got on a steamer and went to Washington. And took it up to a very prominent man down there, and I presented it to him, and he looked at it, and he congratulated me upon such a wonderful device. Prior to saying, Mr. Edison, this is the last thing we need here. Anything that would speed things up. You see, I had overlooked a little thing called a filibuster. And I came away from there, and that taught me a lesson that I've lived with my entire life. And I made a commitment to myself that I would never invent anything that you didn't want. In other words, I didn't want to invent anything that wouldn't sell. Now, why is that? Because I'm a greedy capitalist? I'm a capitalist, but I don't consider myself greedy. I don't want for much, but I don't need much. And but what I do need is to continue to do with what I love in my life. I was very fortunate to have a mother that helped me discover that I had a tremendous interest in science. Now, maybe you want to know a little bit about my education. Would that be important to you? Won't take long. 3 months. 3 months in first grade, and I was convinced that I was a dunce. I was always at the foot of the class. There were X's all over my papers at all times. And see, I had a hard time as a child, and probably still do, of remaining focused and sitting in my seat without getting up and looking out the window and things like that. And that coupled with being what I call incurably curious, I ask a lot of questions. And I ask too many questions, I think, of Dr. Engel, who was the headmaster there in our school in Port Huron. And I overheard him one day tell his wife, "That Edison boy." oh, me. He's addled. Addled. I hadn't heard that word, but my mother had, and when I told her, she promptly took me out of that school, and she homeschooled me till I was 12, when I thought I had enough education, and I've been self-taught ever since. And so my grammar isn't always the best, but my mother helped me discover the love for science, and the love for nature, and I've never lost that. I've got a lot of interest, and my mind still goes to and fro at times, but now I've learned how to handle that, and that's with a whole lot of naps. I find that the nap helps me. Well, I only sleep 4 hours a night. Most of my life, as I've gotten older, I've slept a little more regular, but not like most people sleep. And, you know, I think too much sleep is like a drug. It makes you dopey. You lose time and opportunities. And so I take a lot of naps, and doesn't matter where. It could be on the bench, on a floor, or wherever. But I spend time with myself, thinking. And I'm a man who believes that thinking is hard work, real thinking. I happen to be of the opinion that most people don't think. I would dare to say that probably 5% of people really think. About 10% think they think. And the other 85 would rather die than think. Oh my goodness, sorry, I forgot I hadn't taken my hat off. Well, And so I want to give you this setting, and it's in New Jersey. Any of you from New Jersey? How about that other state that hooks on there? New York. All right, well, we'll talk a little bit about New York. And I will tell you first of all about New Jersey. I ended up in New Jersey from a stint for 5.5 years, a sentence, in Newark. And I was in Newark, having left New York City, working, I initially worked for a company called the Laws Gold Indicator Company, and Mr. Laws was an inventor, and he invented a device that would get the stocks, the gold prices from the gold exchange, and then he sold that information to about 300 stockbrokers on Wall Street. And it was based on the telegraph. I was a little bit familiar with it. Well, it's a long story for another time, but I ended up making a deal with the Laws Gold Indicator Company, who later sold to Western Union, that if I helped them improve that particular device and brought out other devices, would they buy it? Because you see, they had offered me $300 a month to work there, and I didn't come into New York City. I came into New York City from Boston, and I'd had jobs. I didn't want a job. I wanted to be an inventor. And I had a vision for what I wanted to do, and that is just invent. And invent only things that would sell and that you would buy and that you would find to have utility. A lot of people have referred to me as a scientist over the years, and I never have called myself a scientist. I don't claim to be one. But I have to be involved in science, and I have different approaches to things. I look at things differently than a lot of scientists do. I happen to believe that scientists generally stop at the point of discovery. That's generally where I start. And so we've had some differences. But in Menlo Park, it was between New York City and Philadelphia. And it was a little plot of ground of about 33 acres. It wasn't a city and it wasn't a park. It was a bankrupt subdivision. Man went bust there, and he had only built 5 dwellings. And one of them ended up being my home, another one a boarding house for our men, and I built a laboratory there that was 2 stories tall, 30 feet wide, and 100 feet long, and the top was our lab. Down below was the machine shop, kind of like brain and brawn. And right there is where we brought out a lot of devices that you've used continually since that time. The year was 1876 when we moved in there. I had a little run-in with a landlord in Newark. That helped, motivate me to get out of there. But this little plot of ground was a beautiful, peaceful place, nice rolling meadow, a lot of trees, and some of the streets were already cut in there, and it was ideal for us. I had my father, who could do anything, come down from Port Huron and build this for me, and we moved in there in late '76, and we'd been working on a couple of things in Newark. One of them was called the electric pen, and many, many, many devices that had improved the speed of telegraphy. And I made some pretty good money, and we had money put away, and we could afford to build this lab, and I could have my dream laboratory. I'd never been without a laboratory at that time since I was 10 years old. Always had a lab wherever I was. Well, right there in Menlo Park, not too long after we moved in, I had a request from Western Union to improve this telephone, which I said earlier was an invention, but you'd never buy it because it didn't have any clarity. And so what they wanted me to do was to improve the transmitter, which we did. And that was actually a microphone, and so I invented the microphone. But it was a transmitter for the telephone. Now, I don't mean to say anything derogatory about Dr. Bell. He did invent that phone, and it worked fine, provided that you could go over to the person who made the call and ask them what they said. Worked perfectly. But there in Menlo is where it all began, where I began to learn about a real need. It wasn't where I began to learn about it, but a real need. But I wasn't that interested in following the lamp when we got there. I had looked into it, but I've got too many other things that I'm working on. And one of them was that telephone. And there were a lot of things. But I had a friend, his name was Dr. Barker. He was a professor of engineering at University of Pennsylvania. And he loved to come out to the lab and get what I was doing and have me tell him what's going on, and then he would lecture on that. And many times I could give him a great story, and a lot of times I couldn't give him anything. But he gave me a story that he had been to the Philadelphia Exposition, and he had met a couple gentlemen there who had improved the dynamo. Now the dynamo, today, what you call a generator. Something had to generate electricity. Well, at the time, science had said that a generator or a dynamo burned up most of its power itself. And the output was only probably 35% at the most, maybe 40 on some machines. And it burned up all that through friction and heat loss. Most of its power was burned up by itself. Now, I know people like that. You might know a few. You know, being busy doesn't always result in real work. Well, so he wanted me to go up to Ansonia, Connecticut, Ansonia. And I went up there and met these two men, and they were involved in lighting. How many in here, let me ask you this first, think that I invented the light bulb? Some of you, this is a sharp crowd. I did not invent the light bulb. I perfected the incandescent lamp, which will burn in your home. There was a light bulb already and had been for many years. But it was based upon another principle, and it was called an arc lamp. How many of you have ever been to Broadway? How many of you know what they used to call Broadway? The Great White Way. Now, how many of you know why they called it the Great White Way? Arc lights. And they lit it like daylight. And you didn't dare look into them as I can with these lamps, because it would almost be the same result on your eye as looking into the sun. And they only lasted a few days. There were 2 carbon rods, and instead of a nice soft glowing filament between them, there was fire. Basically, it was an arc. It was a spark. And it made a lot of noise. But what had the power of that was a thing called alternating current. Now, many of you have power lines around you, do you? Most of you have electricity, I assume. You are a bright crowd. Well, if you took those lines that run behind your home and run them straight into your home, what do you think would happen? Not good things. That electricity has to be stepped down by a thing called a transformer, or 2 or 3. And then it's made mild for you. And now I think you still use 110. Guess who came up with that number? You're looking at him. The threads on your light bulb, I understand, are still the same, even on your new light bulb. What we came up with in 1879 and 1880. I didn't work on the light bulb because, I guess, common sense. You know, some people ask me, Mr. Edison, why do you think you're so successful? I tell them 3 things. Number 1 is common sense. Not so common, is it? Number 2, hard work. Number 3, stick-to-itiveness. Stay with it. You know, a lump of coal, well, let me say it this way. A diamond. A diamond is simply a lump of coal that's stuck to the job. One of our greatest weaknesses is giving up just before success. Should always try just one more time. Well, there in Menlo, it was very busy, and it wasn't too long after we moved there that we were working on the automatic telegraph. And through the automatic telegraph, which I don't have time to tell you how exactly it happened, but I got the idea that I could record sound, and not only sound, but the human voice, and be able to play it back. And we were able to do that. And I took that device that we had, didn't look quite like this one, a little earlier model, to the Scientific American the very next day. And it made the Scientific American, and then it made every newspaper pretty much in the world. And they said I was the most famous American at the time, almost overnight, because of that invention. And they called me the Wizard of Menlo Park. I'm no wizard. They also called me a genius. I've never considered myself a genius. One of the reasons is what I just said, is common sense is what you have to use. Now, would you like to hear a little common sense? It's 1877, 78, and I invent a light bulb, and I perfect the filament and its incandescence, and it burns beautifully in my laboratory. Will you buy it? Now, why? It works beautifully. It doesn't run on gas. Just ask the gas companies after Mr. Edison made the statement to the New York Sun that he had the lamp, incandescent lamp. Well, in London, the gas stocks went down 25% the next day. After all, it was the Wizard of Menlo Park who made that statement. And people thought, he can do anything. Well, I want to tell you, I'm an inventor, but I'm half inventor and half showman. I wanted to be an actor when I was a young man. I like more than just inventing. I'm interested in manufacturing as well, and selling those things, and marketing, what you call marketing, advertising, and to do all of that. But I'm not going to be so foolish as to work on a lamp without having the confidence that I can deliver electricity to your home. And that's what we did. And when I met those 2 men in Ansonia who were lighting all of the arc lights everywhere with those dangerous cobwebs of wires all through New York City for those arc lights, I knew there was a better way. And when I saw what they had done with that dynamo, I immediately saw in my mind the answer. I did calculations all the way back to Menlo Park about the costs that I thought would be involved in order to compete with gas, because bringing out something new, as I said, takes 6 to 7 years before it's really accepted, and it better be competitive if you're going to be buying it to substitute for something else that you're used to using that really hasn't been all that bad. You with me? Well, when I saw that, I had so much confidence. I was 30 years old, and I knew I couldn't wait to get back to Menlo to start work on that dynamo. Now, dynamos in those days were about this big. We ended up with one that was 25 tons, and we made 6 of them. I won't give you all the story of the light bulb itself. Many of you know that story to a certain degree, but I will tell you this, that just the filament alone took 10,000 individual tries. To say nothing of coming up with the shape of the bulb, how to evacuate the oxygen, the vacuum, to take that oxygen out of there so that that thing didn't burn up, and all of the other details, and it took time. And I told the son, a little premature, he asked me, Mr. Edison, how long before you can bring it out? I said 6 weeks. That was in late September of 1878. We brought it out the 21st of October in 1879. That was the first time that we had it glow. Now, we had a lot of successes, but this was the first time it really stayed on, and it went 13 and a half hours, the 21st of October. I told my men the minute we had it, get prepared, we're going to light this whole subdivision here. And the lab, Mrs. Jordan's boarding house, and my office, everything's going to be lit, and we're inviting the world to a New Year's Eve party. And we've got from the 21st of October to the 31st of December. You can imagine how they looked at me, but we pulled it off. And there for the first time, as those people came up a little plank road from a little depot we were right off the Pennsylvania Railroad, and the sun was going down. It was about 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and the snow was starting to come down, and those flakes came down across those little lamps like little tiny diamonds. And for the first time, these people who are all dressed up came in there, celebrated the new year, 1880, and for the first time they saw a subdivision lit with incandescents. Well, it's easy down the road to take that for granted. Let me tell you about some people who I have clippings out of newspapers here. Here's a fellow that was brought in by the London House of Commons for the specific reason to investigate lighting by electricity. I don't have this person's name, but here is what one of the men, what they said. Ha ha! Replied the witness, that fellow, we scientists know him well. He has never put forward any practical statement in connection with this invention to induce the scientific man to pay much attention to it. Sylvanus Thompson, leading authority, wrote books, textbooks on electricity from London. We later heard that he was with the gas company as well. We have heard a great deal of late Mr. Edison's discovery of a means of indefinitely subdividing the light. Subdividing the light means that to get lights to burn in a series all up and down a street, commercial, residential, that just couldn't be done because they were looking at it in only one way. I looked at things a lot of different ways, and I saw that it could be done. I cannot tell you what his method may be, but this I can tell you, that any system depending upon incandescence will fail. This is what I had to contend with and what my financiers had to contend with. My main financier's name was Morgan. That's right, JP. But I want to tell you this, he was a man of integrity. He was a man of his word. He was a man that I could trust and always have. But he wasn't easy to deal with. But we were able to borrow $300,000 from Mr. Morgan, thanks to my lawyer, and who had known him a long time. And Mr. Vanderbilt was involved. And a few other people. One man owned the steamship line, half the railroad in the west, and his name was Villard. And the first thing that we ever lit with that generator after we improved it was one of his steamboats right there in Perth Amboy. Well, the problem of inventing that filament to work was nothing compared to getting that generator to put out 90% instead of the 35 that all science, all the people in physics, although it wasn't called physics in those days, all of the leading authorities said that that couldn't be done. And I knew if it couldn't be done, then I couldn't subdivide the light, but we did it. 90% output. And the day came when I had to bring out a few folks from New York City. And they were called aldermen. Because not too long before that little meeting of bringing out the aldermen, I thought, how can I get the world's attention? I'm going to need more than $300,000 as we go along, because I knew that I could light the world. And I saw it. I knew what I wanted to do. But where do you start? How do you get the world's attention? And what I told the newspapers was, I'll light Manhattan. I'll get the world's attention. And we set out to do that. And I knew that I had to bury those lines underground, where there was no more room in that spider web of alternating current lines. Those arc lights were burning all that electricity up. When the ice hadn't formed on them, and they broke and they fell down and killed horses and men and little boys. Very dangerous stuff. I didn't want anything to do with it. I believe in direct current, still do, always did. And maybe a little later you can have a question or two, and that's usually one of them. And I'll be happy to try to field it, although to really answer it would take all night. But what it took was to put together 6 dynamos lined up. And we found this little place on Pearl Street near the Brooklyn Bridge. Not the best area of town at that time, but it was 2 stories, all open inside, and we began to work on that. But it wasn't until that we had the aldermen out for a little get-together. I took them around on a little excursion around the area, and I wore them out. Took them on a ride on my electric railroad. I was working on the storage battery even then. This is long before that I developed the storage battery that powered those electric cars that were working very, very well in the late 1900s, and especially in the 1890s, I should say, and 1910. We had the electric car was being used in a fair amount, but the public rejected it. They didn't want to buy it. They liked Henry's thing. Made noise, went faster. There was something romantic about it, and the public pretty much shut down the sale of electric cars. More about that later if you want. Didn't know that, did you? I actually owned an electric car company at one time that ended up with, I didn't want one, and I had to take it over, and ended up selling it to what you now know as Mack Trucks, Pennsylvania. And you know they didn't do anything with it either. Well, it came time to, these aldermen were getting weary, and they thought they were going to get back on the train, and they were hungry. But I took them back to the lab, and the lab was all dark. I had to take them upstairs from the machine shop, and when we all got to the top of the stairs, we lit the entire second floor with incandescents. And there in front of them was an array of the most beautiful food that Delmonico's could deliver. I told you, I'm half inventor and half showman. I know what it is to get the attention of the public, and that's what we had to do. We were changing society when I knew that this would change our lives. But because the time is brief on this takes a long time to really give you the whole story. I will tell you that the alderman okayed me to dig up the streets of Lower Manhattan, the financial district. Why do you think I would start there? Would you like to guess whose home I first lit with an isolated power plant in his basement? Oh, you're sharp. JP, yep. Now, that was an interesting experience, to say the least. Well, Labor Day, 1882, the day before Labor Day was Sunday, and we had to give that group of dynamos a test. And we thought they were all going to come unglued. They had to be in perfect sync, and they weren't. And we had a terrible accident, and we had to repair it before 3 o'clock on Labor Day because Mr. Edison had told the world that he was lighting Manhattan, and that was the day we flipped the switch. But at 3 o'clock, it was kind of an overcast day, went down, walked down the street, a couple streets, to Drexel Morgan's office. And there, at 3 o'clock, all my men waiting, we flipped a switch, and lights went on all over Lower Manhattan, and they all worked. Only about 400 lamps to start with, but it went on, as you know, and that got the attention of London and Paris, South America, the Far East, and we began to get orders for power plants all over the world, and we built them. And I continued to get criticism and called every name in the book. I remember a reporter came out one time when we were working on the filament. He said, "Mr. Edison, we understand that you've failed 1,000 times at this filament." He didn't know the half of it. And said, "I did not fail 1,000 times. In fact, I've succeeded in finding 1,000 things that won't work." I don't look at that as failure. We learned something from every one of those filaments that burned out, including pieces of beard out of my men's beards. We tried anything. We ransacked all over the continent of South America looking for plant life that would lend itself to being carbonized, baked at over 1,000 degrees, where it would hold that glow. I said, I have not failed 1,000 times. I found all the things that won't work. And when I've found everything that won't work, I will find something that will work. Remember the lump of coal? That's common sense. And don't quit. We don't have time for me to elaborate too much more on this particular issue, but I would like to tell you, as I mentioned, I have people ask me from time to time, what do I attribute my success? Well, sometimes I give a lot of different answers because there are a lot of different answers. And one of the things that I tell folks is that I suppose that I just fail so much faster than everyone else. Well, I had assembled initially at Menlo about a dozen men, and they were from just about every corner of the earth. And so they were some of the most talented men, and hardworking and honest and forthright. And had I not had those men that understood Mr. Edison pretty well and were dedicated to my ideas, you would not know my name today. You would have never heard of me because I could not do that alone. The bulb works fine in a vacuum, but not what we were trying to do. Not one man. But because that name, Edison, was known, that was a brand. So I put it on everything. Everything had either, this has my picture on it. This is a cylinder, 2 minutes long. I won't tell you what it is, nor will I play it for you. I promise. But that's what I did. And you know my name. And a lot of these men, Kiersey, Batchelor, Johnson, Upton, marvelous men. And they came from every corner of the earth. Here. Stick-to-itiveness, very important. But you can't stick to it if you're not free. What I believe was the key to Menlo Park, which I, by the way, called my invention factory, which, by the way, I consider my greatest of all inventions, because it led to what you now call, in my company that I gave birth to, called General Electric, now call it, and you call it, research and development. That was my greatest invention. Second greatest maybe was this whole system to deliver electricity to the world. But had it not been for the freedom, for the incentive, I don't think I would have ever had the motivation to do that. Because you see, I'd had many, many businesses. And I've had over 100 businesses that I was either owner of, a part owner of, or had some interest in my 72 years of productivity. Freedom. That's how you get those men. And that's the atmosphere in which these inventions are brought out, and no telling what is in the future with this chain lightning, what you call electricity. You know, America has seen a lot of setbacks, but in every case, it's always emerged a stronger and more powerful nation. So, have faith. Have faith as your fathers before you. Have faith, but most of all, go forward. I've enjoyed it.